My father kicked me out of the house for buying a boat. He yelled, "If you're so smart, then go live in your boat." After what I did later, he deeply regretted it. Let me tell you how this whole mess started. You know how some kids dream about becoming astronauts or firefighters? Well, I had this crazy obsession with fishing boats. Not the fancy yacht kind that rich people show off at marinas, but the real deal, working boats that smell like diesel and salt water. I was 17 and had been saving every penny for 3 years. While my buddies were blowing their paychecks on video games and sneakers, I was stashing cash in an old coffee, under my bed like some kind of Depression-era kid. I worked at Jimmy's car wash downtown, scrubbing bird droppings off BMWs and getting soaked by the pressure washers. Weekends, I'd flip burgers at this greasy diner where the cook chain smoked and the coffee tasted like it was filtered through gym socks. But the real money came from my eBay hustle. I'd hit up garage sales at dawn, buying old electronics and random junk that suburban moms were desperate to get rid of. A vintage radio here, some baseball cards there. I had an eye for stuff that looked worthless, but was actually worth something to collectors. My room looked like a thrift store exploded, but every sale got me closer to my goal. My dad thought I was completely nuts. He'd see me counting crumpled bills at the kitchen table and shake his head like I was planning to join the circus. When I told him I wanted to buy a fishing boat and work the waters off Cape Cod, he'd laugh so hard he'd start coughing up his morning coffee. The guy worked construction his whole life, came home every day covered in sawdust and concrete dust, and here I was talking about becoming some kind of modern-day fisherman. He kept pushing the community college brochures at me, talking about getting a real degree in something practical like accounting or business management. But I wasn't backing down. I'd spend hours watching YouTube videos of commercial fishermen, studying tide charts, and learning about different types of nets and lines. I knew the difference between a gill net and a trawl, could identify fish species by their fins, and had memorized the Coast Guard safety regulations. This wasn't some teenage fantasy. I was dead serious about making it work. The boat I had my eye on was a 1987 Chris Craft that some old-timer in Gloucester was selling. It wasn't pretty. The paint was peeling, the engine needed work, and the cabin smelled like 40 years of cigarettes and fish guts. But it was solid, seaworthy, and within my budget if I could scrape together another $800. I remember the exact moment everything went sideways. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I'd finally saved enough. I took the bus to Gloucester, met the seller at the marina, and handed over a stack of 20s and 10s that represented 3 years of my life. The old guy shook my hand, signed over the title, and gave me the keys. When I got home that evening, I was practically vibrating with excitement. I burst through the front door, waving the boat keys like I'd won the lottery. My mom was stirring something on the stove, and Dad was reading the sports section at the kitchen table. I announced that I'd bought the boat and wasn't going to enroll in community college in the fall. Instead, I was going to get my commercial fishing license and start working the waters around Nantucket. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom stopped stirring. Dad slowly folded his newspaper. What happened next was like watching a volcano erupt in slow motion. Dad's face went from confused to annoyed to absolutely furious in about 3 seconds. He stood up so fast his chair fell over, and I could see that vein in his forehead starting to throb. Never a good sign. He started yelling about how I was throwing my life away, how fishing was a dying industry, how I'd never make enough money to support myself. He called me stubborn, naive, and a bunch of other things I won't repeat. But the worst part was when he said I was just trying to avoid growing up and taking responsibility like a real man. That's when I snapped back that I was taking responsibility for my own life and my own choices. I wasn't asking him to pay for anything or bail me out if things went wrong. I'd earned every dollar, done my research, and was ready to work harder than he'd ever seen me work. The argument escalated until we were both screaming. Mom tried to play peacemaker, but we were way past that point. Finally, Dad delivered his ultimatum with the kind of cold fury that makes your blood freeze. He said if I was so smart and independent, then I could go live in my boat and see how long I lasted without Mommy and Daddy to fall back on. I called his bluff, went upstairs, packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags and a backpack, and walked out the front door. As I was loading my stuff into my beat-up Honda Civic, I could see Mom crying at the kitchen window. Dad was nowhere to be seen. The drive to Marina felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Part of me expected Dad to come racing after me, apologizing and asking me to come home. But my phone stayed silent. When I pulled into Marina parking lot and saw my boat bobbing in the dim light of the dock lamps, reality hit me like a slap in the face. I was 18 years old, had about $400 in cash, and was about to try living on a boat that barely had enough room for a sleeping bag. The smart thing would have been to swallow my pride and go home. But I was too stubborn and too angry to admit I might have made a mistake. That first night was brutal. The boat rocked constantly, even in protected harbor, and every creak and groan made me think I was about to sink. I lay awake on a narrow bunk, listening to the water slapping against the hull and wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But as the sun started to rise over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete freedom. No one telling me what to do, where to go, or how to live my life. Just me, the ocean, and whatever I could make of it. I had no idea that this crazy decision would lead to the most incredible discovery of my life, or that in just a few months, Dad would be eating every word he'd said that night. All I knew was that I was finally living on my own terms, and that had to count for something. The adventure was just beginning. Living on a boat sounds romantic until you actually try it. The reality hit me like a bucket of ice water on day 2 when I woke up with my sleeping bag soaked from condensation, and my back feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The narrow bunk was designed for someone about 5 feet tall, and I'm 6'2" with shoulders that don't fit through most doorways. But I wasn't about to give up. I'd invested too much pride and money to turn back now. The marina had basic facilities. A shower house that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, and a small store that sold overpriced coffee and stale donuts. The dock master, a grizzled old guy named Pete who looked like he'd been pickled in salt water, gave me the stink eye every morning. Getting my commercial fishing license was easier than I expected. The Coast Guard office in Boston processed my application in about a week, and I passed the basic safety course without breaking a sweat. All those hours watching YouTube videos and reading fishing forums had actually paid off. I knew the regulations, understood the quotas, and could identify most of the fish species I'd be targeting. The hard part was figuring out how to actually make money. I bought basic gear, some nets, lines, a few tackle boxes, and a cooler big enough to hold my catch. My budget was tight, so I went with the cheapest stuff I could find at a fishing supply store in Hyannis. The salesperson, a middle-aged woman with sun-damaged skin and knowing eyes, looked at my shiny new equipment and just shook her head. My first morning out on the water was a disaster wrapped in a catastrophe. I left the harbor at dawn, confident that I'd figured out the basics from watching other fishermen. The engine ran smooth, the weather was decent, and I had enough fuel to stay out for most of the day. What could go wrong? Everything, apparently. First, I got seasick about 2 miles from shore. Not just queasy, full-blown, hanging over the side, wishing I was dead seasick. I'd never had motion sickness before, but something about the rolling waves and the diesel fumes triggered my body's revolt against the maritime lifestyle. Then I tried to set my first net. I'd watched dozens of videos, but actually doing it while fighting nausea and trying to keep the boat steady was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a roller coaster. I got the net tangled around the propeller, spent 2 hours cutting it free with a knife, and managed to catch exactly nothing except a plastic bag and what looked like someone's old sneaker. The other fishermen I saw that day gave me a wide berth. You could tell they'd spotted the rookie from a mile away. There's apparently an unwritten rule that you don't mess with the new guy's learning process, but you also don't offer help unless someone's actually drowning. By the end of the first week, I burned through half my cash on fuel and had caught maybe 10 pounds of fish, mostly small stuff that the local market barely wanted. The guy at the fish market, a stocky Portuguese man who spoke in rapid-fire English mixed with what sounded like curses, looked at my pathetic haul and offered me about $20 for the whole lot. $20. After a week of work, sunburn, and humiliation, I did the math and realized I was losing money faster than a gambling addict in Atlantic City. At this rate, I'd be broke within a month and would have to slink back home with my tail between my legs. The physical toll was even worse than the financial one. My hands were raw from handling ropes and nets, covering cuts that stung like fire every time salt water hit them. My face looked like I'd been slapped by a lobster, red, peeling, and painful to touch. I'd gone through a whole bottle of sunscreen in 3 days, but apparently I'd been applying it wrong, because my neck and arms were burnt to a crisp. The worst part was the isolation. I'd been so focused on the technical aspects of fishing that I hadn't thought about what it would be like to spend 12 hours a day alone on the water. No music, no conversation, just the sound of waves and the constant worry about whether I was doing everything wrong. At night, I'd lie in my cramped bunk and listen to the other fishermen talking on their boats. Through the thin walls, I could hear conversations about good fishing spots, weather patterns, and equipment repairs. But when I tried to join in, the talking would stop. I was the outsider, the city kid who thought he could waltz into their world and make it look easy. The marina shower house became my refuge. It was one of the few places where I could be alone with my thoughts and actually feel clean. The water pressure was terrible and the temperature fluctuated wildly, but it was better than trying to wash with a bucket of cold harbor water. By the second week, I was starting to understand why Dad had been so angry. This wasn't just about the boat or the money. It was about watching his son choose a path that seemed designed to fail. Every morning when I limped back to the dock with another disappointing catch, I could feel the weight of his predictions coming true. The other fishermen at the marina had stopped pretending to ignore me. Now they were openly skeptical, making comments about city boys who thought fishing was like a video game. One guy, a weathered veteran named Tommy, who'd been working these waters for 30 years, finally approached me while I was untangling yet another snarled net. Tommy looked at my setup, shook his head, and walked away without saying a word. But the next morning, I found a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper with a hand-drawn map showing some fishing spots about 5 miles offshore. No signature, no explanation, just a grudging acknowledgement that maybe I deserved a chance to prove myself. That map changed everything. The spots Tommy had marked were productive in ways I hadn't imagined. Instead of coming back with a few pounds of random fish, I started hauling in decent catches of cod, haddock, and flounder. Nothing spectacular, but enough to cover my fuel costs and maybe even make a small profit. The breakthrough came on a foggy morning in early April. I'd been working one of Tommy's spots when my net snagged on something big underwater. At first, I thought I'd hit a rock or some debris, but the way it felt when I pulled suggested something different. Something that might actually be worth the effort to retrieve. I spent the next hour carefully working the net free, fighting against whatever had trapped it. When I finally got to the surface, I found myself staring at the biggest striped bass I'd ever seen. Easily 40 pounds and worth more than everything I'd caught in the previous 2 weeks combined. That fish changed how the other fishermen looked at me. Suddenly, I wasn't just a stubborn kid who'd gotten lucky with a big catch. I was someone who'd put in the work, learned from mistakes, and earned his place on the water. Tommy nodded approvingly when I showed him the bass, and even Pete the dock master cracked a smile. But I had no idea that my real breakthrough was still weeks away, hidden in the deep waters where the whales migrate. The discovery that would change everything was waiting out there, floating in the darkness like a secret that only the ocean knew. 6 weeks into my floating adventure, I'd finally found my rhythm. The seasickness was mostly gone. My hands had developed calluses thick enough to handle rope without crying like a baby, and I'd learned to read the water in ways that would have seemed impossible back when I was flipping burgers and washing cars. The morning that changed everything started like any other. I was up before sunrise, checking the weather radio and planning my route based on the tide charts I'd finally learned to interpret. The forecast called for light winds and calm seas, perfect conditions for trying out a new spot I've been eyeing about 8 miles northeast of the harbor. The water was mirror smooth as I headed out, with just enough breeze to keep the diesel fumes from settling around the boat. I'd been experimenting with different net depths and had started to understand how fish move through the water column, depending on temperature and time of day. It was like learning a new language, except the words were currents and the grammar was written in the behavior of schools of fish. My target area was near where the continental shelf drops off into deeper water. I'd noticed that commercial fishing boats seemed to work this area heavily, and Tommy had mentioned something about good bottom fishing when the tide was right. The depth finder showed about 60 feet of water with a rocky bottom, perfect for the kind of fish that brought decent money at the market. I set my nets and started working the area systematically, moving in a grid pattern that I'd learned from watching the pros. The first few hauls were decent. Some cod, a few flounder, and a handful of scup that would at least cover my fuel costs. But on the fourth pass, something felt different when I started pulling in the net. The resistance was strange, not like the fighting way to fish, but more like I'd snagged something heavy and awkward. I've pulled up all kinds of junk from the bottom. Old tires, pieces of dock, even a shopping cart that someone had apparently dumped overboard. But this felt different, almost organic in the way it moved through the water. When I finally got to the surface, I found myself staring at what looked like a massive chunk of gray-white fat. It was roughly the size of a basketball, maybe a little bigger, and covered in what appeared to be a waxy coating that gleamed in the morning sunlight. The smell hit me immediately, like low tide mixed with something musky and animal-like, but not quite rotten. My first instinct was to throw it back. It looked disgusting, smelled worse, and was taking up valuable space in my cooler. But something made me pause. I'd been reading everything I could get my hands on about marine biology and ocean ecology, try to understand the ecosystem I was now part of. This thing looked familiar, like something I'd seen in a documentary or read about online. I carefully lifted it into the boat, using a net to avoid touching it directly. The texture was waxy and surprisingly firm, not squishy like I'd expected. There were no obvious signs of decay, and despite the smell, it didn't seem to be rotting. It was just strange, like nothing I'd ever encountered before. The more I looked at it, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just random ocean garbage. There was something deliberate about its formation, almost like it had been shaped by some biological process. I remember reading about whale behavior and how they sometimes regurgitate or excrete materials that could wash up on beaches. That's when it hit me. I pulled out my phone and started frantically searching for images of ambergris, the legendary whale substance that perfume makers had been using for centuries. The photos I found looked remarkably similar to what was sitting in my cooler, though most of the samples in the pictures were much smaller than my find. According to what I was reading, ambergris forms in the digestive system of sperm whales, usually around hard objects like squid beaks that the whale can't digest normally. Over time, it gets coated with this waxy substance and eventually gets expelled from the whale's body. The really valuable stuff ages in the ocean for years, developing a complex scent that perfume makers prize above almost everything else. I took dozens of photos from every angle, trying to document the size, color, and texture. The articles I was reading mentioned that genuine ambergris has specific characteristics. It should be relatively lightweight for its size, have a distinctive smell that's not purely unpleasant, and often contains bits of squid beaks or other marine debris. My find checked all the boxes. Despite its size, it felt lighter than it should have, almost like it was partially hollow. The smell was definitely strong, but underneath the initial unpleasantness, there was something almost sweet and complex. And when I looked closely, I could see small dark specks embedded in the waxy surface that looked exactly like the squid beak fragments described in the articles. The problem was verification. I couldn't exactly walk into the local fish market and ask the Portuguese guy if he knew anything about whale vomit. This was the kind of thing that needed expert evaluation, and I had no idea where to find someone qualified to authenticate ambergris in the middle of coastal Massachusetts. I spent the rest of the day fishing with one eye on my nets and the other on my phone, researching everything I could find about ambergris dealers and appraisers. Most of the information was vague or contradictory, but I finally found a reference to a marine biologist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution who supposedly had experience with whale-derived materials. By the time I headed back to harbor, I'd made my decision. I wrapped the mysterious chunk in plastic bags and stored it in my cooler with ice packs, treating it like the potentially valuable treasure it might be. The logical part of my brain said I was probably deluding myself, that I found nothing more than a weird piece of floating garbage that would end up costing me money to dispose of properly. But the optimistic part, the same part that had convinced me to buy a boat against all rational advice, whispered that maybe, just maybe, I'd stumbled onto something that could change everything. That after weeks of scraping by on small catches and burning through my savings, the ocean had finally decided to give me a real opportunity. That night, I lay in my bunk with the cooler secured next to me, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. The smell of my find had permeated the entire cabin, a constant reminder of the possibility that my life might be about to take a dramatic turn. I'd gone from being a stubborn kid living on a boat to someone who might have just made the kind of discovery that fishermen dream about their entire careers. The next morning, I would drive to Woods Hole with my mysterious treasure, hoping that an expert could tell me whether I'd found fortune or just an expensive piece of ocean garbage. But for now, I was content to dream about the possibilities and wonder what Dad would say if this crazy gamble actually paid off. The drive to Woods Hole felt like the longest hour of my life. I'd borrowed a cooler on wheels from Pete the dockmaster, claiming I needed it for a big fishing trip. The reality was that I had what might be the most valuable thing I'd ever touched sitting in the back of my beat-up Honda, and I was terrified of hitting a pothole and somehow damaging it. Dr. Sarah Chun turned out to be nothing like what I'd expected from a marine biologist. Instead of some elderly professor in a lab coat, she was probably her 40s, with short black hair and the kind of tan that comes from spending real time on research vessels. Her office overlooked the harbor and was filled with specimens in jars, nautical charts, and what looked like whale bones mounted on the walls. When I explained what I'd found, she raised an eyebrow but didn't laugh or dismiss me outright. She'd dealt with enough fishermen over the years to know that the ocean occasionally coughed up genuinely interesting things. Still, I could tell she was skeptical as I wheeled the cooler into her lab space. The moment I opened the container, her expression changed completely. She leaned forward, took a careful sniff, and her eyes widened in a way that made my heart start racing. Without saying a word, she pulled on latex gloves and carefully lifted the chunk out of the cooler, weighing it in her hands and examining the surface texture. What happened next was like watching a detective solve a case. Dr. Chen used a small knife to scrape off a tiny sample, which she examined under a microscope. She tested the density by dropping small pieces into different solutions, photographed it from multiple angles, and even used some kind of spectrometer to analyze the chemical composition. The entire process took about 2 hours, during which I paced around her lab like an expectant father, trying not to touch anything that looked expensive or scientific. Every few minutes, she'd make a small humming sound that could have meant anything from confirmation to complete dismissal of my hopes. Finally, she set down her instruments and looked at me with the kind of expression that professors reserve for students who've just surprised them with an unexpectedly brilliant answer. She confirmed that what I'd found was indeed ambergris, and not just any ambergris. It was an exceptional specimen that had clearly been aging in the ocean for years, possibly decades. The quality was what made it special. Most ambergris that washes up on beaches has been degraded by sun and sand, losing much of its commercial value. But my find had been protected underwater, maintaining the complex chemical structure that made it so valuable to perfume manufacturers. Dr. Chen explained that the waxy coating had preserved the internal material in nearly perfect condition. She weighed it precisely at 12.7 kilograms, just over 28 pounds of what she described as museum-quality ambergris. The current market value for material of this grade was approximately $75 per gram. I did the math in my head and nearly fell over. We were talking about close to $1 million worth of whale byproduct sitting in a cooler in a marine biology lab. Dr. Chen could see the shock on my face and quickly explained that selling ambergris was more complicated than just finding a buyer. The legal status varied by location. There were international regulations about whale products, and the market was dominated by a small number of specialized dealers who worked primarily with perfume houses in France and Switzerland. But she also knew exactly who to call. Through her research connections, she worked with a private collector named Henri Dubois, who specialized in rare marine-derived materials for the luxury perfume industry. He was based in New York, but traveled regularly to evaluate significant finds, and he'd been looking for high-quality ambergris for a particular project. The phone call was surreal. Dr. Chen spoke in rapid French, occasionally switching to English when she needed to describe technical details. I caught enough to understand that Henri was very interested and could be in Massachusetts within 2 days if the material was as exceptional as Dr. Chin described. Those 2 days were the longest of my life. I moved the ambergris to a climate-controlled storage unit, partly for security and partly because I couldn't handle having something that valuable sitting in my boat cabin. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and found myself constantly checking news websites for stories about ambergris prices crashing or new regulations that might affect the sale. Henri Dubois looked exactly like central casting would order for a French perfume expert, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from handling million-dollar transactions regularly. He examined my find with the same methodical approach as Dr. Chun, but with the additional perspective of someone who understood its commercial applications. The negotiation was surprisingly straightforward. Henri explained that he represented a consortium of perfume houses that were working on a limited edition fragrance line featuring natural ambergris. They'd been searching for material of this quality for over a year, and my find was perfect for their needs. He offered $970,000, with payment handled through a New York bank within 72 hours. I tried to play it cool, but inside I was doing cartwheels. This was more money than I'd ever imagined having, more than most people in my hometown would see in a lifetime. It was enough to buy a proper fishing boat, maybe even a small fleet. It was enough to prove to Dad that I hadn't been completely crazy when I'd walked out that night with my duffel bags and wounded pride. The paperwork took most of the day, with lawyers and bank representatives joining us by conference call to handle the legal details. Henry's team had dealt with unusual high-value transactions before, and they developed systems for handling everything from provenance documentation to tax implications. By evening, I'd signed more documents than when I bought my boat, but the deal was done. The money hit my bank account on a Friday morning. I stared at the balance on my phone screen for about 10 minutes, convinced there had to be some mistake. Then I called the bank to confirm that it was real, that I actually had nearly $1 million in my checking account and wasn't the victim of some elaborate scam. The first thing I did was drive to the marina and pay Pete for 3 months of dock fees in advance. Then I went to the fishing supplies store and bought proper equipment, commercial-grade nets, a fish finder that cost more than my car, and safety gear that would actually keep me alive in rough weather. The saleswoman who'd shaken her head at my cheap gear 6 months earlier just smiled and started adding up numbers. Word spread through the fishing community faster than gossip in a small town. The guys who'd been skeptical about the city kid with the old boat suddenly wanted to know about my fishing spots and techniques. Tommy, who'd given me my first real break with his hand-drawn map, just nodded approvingly when I showed him my new equipment. But the real test was still ahead. I had to call home and tell my parents what had happened. I'd been dreading this conversation for weeks, not because I thought they'd be anything but thrilled, but because it meant admitting that Dad had been right to worry about me, even if his concerns had turned out to be unnecessary. The phone rang 3 times before Mom answered. When I told her I needed to talk to both of them about something important, I could hear the concern in her voice. She probably thought I was calling to ask for money or admit that the whole boat thing had been a disaster. The drive home felt different this time. Instead of the desperate kid who'd packed his life into duffel bags and stormed out 6 months earlier, I was returning as someone who'd actually made it work. The same Honda that had carried me away from my old life was now transporting me back with a bank account that would make most adults dizzy and a story that sounded too crazy to be true. I'd practiced this conversation in my head 1,000 times during the drive, but as I pulled into a familiar driveway, all my carefully planned words evaporated. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and I could see Dad's work boots by the front door, covering the same concrete dust that had defined my childhood memories of him coming home tired and worn down. Mom must have been watching from the kitchen window, because she was out the door before I'd even turned off the engine. She looked older somehow, with new lines around her eyes that I didn't remember being there before. Her hug lasted longer than usual, and I could tell she'd been more worried about me than she'd let on during our brief phone conversations. Dad appeared in the doorway, still holding the newspaper he'd been reading. He looked me up and down, probably noting that I was tanner, leaner, and had the kind of callous hands that come from real work. But he didn't say anything, just nodded slightly and waited for me to explain why I was there. We sat at the same kitchen table where we'd had our blowout argument 6 months earlier. Mom made coffee in the same pot she'd used since I was a kid, and the familiar ritual helped calm my nerves. Dad folded his newspaper carefully and set aside, giving me his full attention in a way that reminded me of childhood conversations about report cards and baseball games. I started with the basics, how I'd struggled at first, learned from the other fishermen, and gradually built up a small but sustainable operation. I told him about the long days on the water, the physical challenges, and the satisfaction of finally understanding an ancient way of life that most people had forgotten existed. Mom asked the practical questions about safety and living conditions, while Dad listened with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for construction blueprints. I could see him processing the information, probably comparing my experience to his own early days in the building trade, when everything had been harder and less certain. Then I told him about the discovery. I explained what ambergris was, how it formed in whale digestive systems, and why it was so valuable to perfume manufacturers. I described a moment I'd pulled it from the water, thinking it was just another piece of ocean garbage, and the gradual realization that I might have found something extraordinary. When I mentioned the final sale price, Dad's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully and asked me to repeat the number. $970,000. Nearly $1 million from something that had been floating in the ocean, waiting for someone curious enough to fish it up instead of throwing it back. The silence that followed was different from the angry quiet of our last conversation. This was a silence of people trying to process information that didn't fit their understanding of how the world worked. Dad had worked construction for 30 years and had never seen that kind of money in one place. Mom had managed household budgets her entire adult life and was struggling to comprehend what that amount could mean for our family's future. Dad finally spoke, and his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He asked if I was sure about the money, if it was really in my account and not some kind of scam. When I showed him the bank statement on my phone, he stared at it for a long time, then handed it back without comment. What he said next surprised me more than anything that had happened in the past 6 months. He apologized, not for being concerned about my choices or for wanting me to have a stable future, but for the way he'd handled our disagreement. He said he'd been so afraid of watching me fail that he'd never considered the possibility that I might succeed in ways he couldn't imagine. Mom started crying then, not from sadness, but from relief and pride mixed together in a way that only parents can experience. She talked about how she'd worried every day, not just about my physical safety, but about the relationship between Dad and me, and whether we'd ever be able to find our way back to each other. I told him about my plans, how I intended to invest most of the money wisely, maybe buy a better boat, and turn fishing into a real business, and how I'd learned that success wasn't just about the money, but about proving to yourself that you could handle whatever life threw at you. Dad asked to see pictures of my boat and my fishing setup. As I scrolled through photos on my phone, he asked technical questions about the engine, the navigation equipment, and the safety gear. It was the first time he'd shown real interest in my chosen profession, and I realized that his concerns had always been about my well-being rather than disapproval of my choices. We talked for hours that afternoon, covering everything from fishing techniques to investment strategies to the strange biology of whale digestive systems. It was the longest conversation Dad and I had shared since I was a kid, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were talking to each other instead of past each other. As the sun started setting, Dad asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything we'd been through together. I was welcomed back in the house, not as a kid who'd failed and needed rescue, but as an adult who'd taken a massive risk and somehow made it work. Mom made my favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, and we ate together like a family that had found its way back to each other. The conversation was lighter now, filled with a kind of easy humor, and shared stories that I'd missed more than I'd realized. That night, I slept in my old bedroom for the first time in 6 months. My childhood posters were still on the walls, but everything felt different now. I wasn't the same person who'd stormed out in anger, and Dad wasn't the same man who delivered that ultimatum about living in my boat. The next morning, I found Dad in the kitchen reading the local newspaper. There was a small article about my discovery, with a headline that read, "Local young fisherman finds rare ocean treasure." He'd circled it in red ink and left it folded next to my coffee cup, We didn't talk about me moving back home permanently, and I didn't mention selling the boat. I'd found something out there on the water that was worth more than money, a sense of independence and capability that I'd never experienced before. But I'd also rediscovered something valuable that I'd left behind, the understanding that family doesn't have to limit your dreams if you're brave enough to pursue them honestly. As I prepared to head back to the marina, Dad handed me a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. It was the same ritual he'd performed thousands of times for his own work, and it felt like a blessing on the path I'd chosen. We shook hands in the driveway, and for the first time in years, it felt like we understood each other completely. The drive back to the harbor was peaceful in a way I'd never experienced before. I had money in the bank, respect for my peers, and a family that believed in me even when my choices seemed crazy. But most importantly, I had the knowledge that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most extraordinary rewards, and that the ocean, like life itself, has a way of surprising you when you're brave enough to venture into the unknown. The boat was waiting for me at the dock, rocking gently in the evening tide, ready for whatever adventure tomorrow might bring.